All right, everyone. I want to say hello to all the attendees who've joined us this evening, and of course, thank our presenters here for joining us. On behalf of the Colorado Sierra Club, the Defenders of Wildlife, and the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, I'd like to welcome you to this special evening with Collin Monda, the director-producers of the award-winning documentary, The Trouble with Wolves. Hopefully, everyone who's come in has seen the film before coming in tonight. I also like to be the first to thank you deeply and sincerely for everything that you've done so far to advance gray wolf restoration in Colorado, in particular to get Initiative 107, now Proposition 107, on the November ballot. As you can see, I think my name shows up. I'm Brian Dushinsky with the Sierra Club. I'll be your host for the next hour or so. Along with Collin Monda, we have with us John Murtoff from the Defenders of Wildlife, and Rob Edward from the Rocky Mountain Action Fund. They're going to be briefing us on the latest developments with Proposition 107 and the upcoming Get Out the Vote campaign. We also have Delia Malone, who is the wildlife chair for the Colorado Sierra Club. She's going to be here to help answer some of your inquiries that you've posted in advance about the science behind wolf restoration. So first, a bit of quick housekeeping. When you registered for this event, you were given an opportunity to ask questions in advance, and to be honest, your response in a word was fairly overwhelming, especially in the last 12 hours, trying to categorize all the questions. But fear not, our presenters tonight are committed to do their best to answer all your questions in the time provided. They all have copies of all the questions that were submitted in advance. But please forgive us in advance if we didn't get to your question or we didn't answer it quite right. We're trying to interpret some of the questions as we go. And we're unfortunately going to be unable to answer additional questions live during the broadcast. So if new questions come up, we won't be able to take them this way. However, I want you to know that if you do have a burning question by the time we're done with the webinar, there's going to be a thank you email to all the attendees coming out in a day or so. And my email address is there with an invitation to ask me any remaining questions that, and I'll route them to our panel here. So with that, please welcome Collin Monda. He's a native Northwest filmmaker. His recent works have been focused on our relationship with nature and finding truth in the complex realism that sits between destructive political divides. He's coming to us live from sunny California. Here's Collin Monda.
Thanks, Brian. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really glad you all could come out, and thanks for coming out. I'm really excited to see how the discussion goes tonight. It's a really interesting time to be putting this film out with everything that's going on in Colorado. So, yeah, I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank the organizations that have helped put this on, and particularly Sierra Club for really being a huge help in working to get this film out to the public, which I think is really important right now. You know, the film was a bit of a process for sure. It took some time, but for it to be, you know, arriving out in the world right now, I almost couldn't think of a better time to become a kind of, you know, playbook for wolf reintroduction, or at least to look at the past and what some of the challenges were to try to do things a little bit differently. The other thing I want to mention up front is, just for any of you that need to drop off, this film is available right now for streaming. So if you feel like sharing it with people you know, particularly people that live in the state, as we get closer to that you know, election in the fall, it'd be really great for as many people as possible to get this balanced picture of what it means, what they're voting on, and getting the education so they can talk about it and consider it. So please help us spread the word if you can. Thank you. And yeah, with that, I think we're going to do a Q&A, and I think Brian's going to tee me up with some questions.
As soon as Brian figures out how to unmute himself. It seems that every time you use a different platform with Zoom, it's like the buttons are in different places. Sorry. Well, Collin, maybe tell people just quickly, not so much a question, but how can they get a hold of you in case people drop off for whatever reason? You've got a website that'll tell them where the various streaming platforms are. They can see your works.
Yeah, there's thetroublewithwolves.com. Pretty easy to remember there. There's a Facebook page. Facebook/The Trouble with Wolves. You can send messages on either of those, and I will field those as best as I can. And you can also subscribe, to the mailing list on the website if you're interested in tracking with, what else happens, what's next for the film, any big events that might be coming up for it.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to just go through your questions, meaning the folks who are attending the webinar here. First question that we have is, what was the most compelling aspect about wolf restoration that called to you? Obviously, it can take a very long time to make a film, and a lot of effort and blood, sweat, tears, and money go into these things. So, what was so compelling that you wanted to devote so much time, and as an artist, to create a documentary about that subject?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I started this one. Started out to make this short film project, but I think it comes back to the fact that I grew up with sort of this fat wolf for a pet, which was our dog, an Alaskan Malamute that we'd rescued from a shelter, and she would be in the backyard and howling as sirens went by. And I think just growing up with that, I had this kind of built-in affinity for wolves, by proxy at least. And her name is Lupa. Actually, she appears at the end of the credits. There's a dedication to her there. But I think a lot of people have that similar connection to wolves in that kind of way. And so when I started out the film, I realized pretty much right away, I don't know anything about wolves in the wild and in America, in the American wild. So I flat out had to just put my pride aside and start building from a blank canvas. But I think oddly, that was one of the more compelling aspects of it, because I realized that these, newspaper and newsletter headlines that I had really taken for truth on the issue were only a fraction of the story. And as soon as I realized that, just starting to learn from the people actually facing living with wolves on a day-to-day basis, and doing some research and putting that all together, putting the story together, I just became fascinated with the whole thing. I think wolves are incredibly, they're so interesting that they just have this amazing dualism to them, where they're this kind of beautiful, majestic creature on the landscape, living in, family structures, and they've got a real playful spirit running around much like dogs do. But then there's also this brutal and necessary need for survival out there that is nature, and particularly wolves, and how they eat. So I think both of those things really kind of come together and to form this really humbling idea that, like, nothing really is black and white, nothing is good and evil, and we just have to reconcile the fact that the world is much more complicated. I think that idea as well kept me going.
Okay. Another question. Did you expect the film to have an impact, or were you hoping it would have some kind of impact while you were creating it? Or, I mean, as an artist, as a filmmaker, you must think a little bit about what might come out of the other end when it's finally released. Did you have any thoughts about that at the time?
Yeah, really, as soon as, again, once I actually knew what the story was, and realized it was so much about listening to the people that I'd talked to, and kind of listening to all viewpoints on either side of it to get to what the actual story was. Once I realized that, I kind of knew what the mission was, and it kind of, while I was editing and trying to put the story together to reflect what I had experienced personally, I went to a screening of another film about kind of coexisting with predators that played in Seattle when I was there, and it had a Q&A afterward and everything, and I watched as after the film it became a pretty heated debate. There was audience members shouting at an organization that I thought was actually pretty great. I really liked a lot of their views and their kind of patience for both sides of the issue with wolves. I just saw a lot of argumentation, and I came away from that screening thinking, I really think if I do it right, I can create something that afterward will have discussion, not argumentation. And I've really been, it's been amazing to just see that mostly that has happened at the screenings I've been at, all the film festival runs and things like that it did. So, I just really committed to trying to do this kind of balanced viewpoint that really felt like, nothing was overlooked, and I wasn't trying to sell any one piece of it too hard, because none of that was my experience when I met these people.
Cool. While you were actually making the film, and I would assume, let's start, I guess the question that someone's asking behind this is presumably like actually while you're filming the participants and what have you, not necessarily the editing and post-production, but when you were making the documentary, um, maybe describe your feelings while you were doing it, and maybe did they change over the course of the film?
Yeah, well, definitely. There was a lot of feelings in there. I already mentioned, kind of feeling like this was really not my story to tell at first, but kind of pushing past that. The really nice connection that came from actually just talking to people that were involved there and not bringing an ego to the conversation or some sort of identified viewpoint with what should be happening there. Um, Aside from those feelings, one of the things that I found really interesting was right when I got back from going and capturing all these interviews, one after the next was just really astounding to our small crew, myself and two other people, that I felt like rather than going out there and realizing like, or feeling a common idea that like humans are so destructive, we're just going to wipe out all the animals and there's no hope. I really felt a very inspiring human moment come from it. And I think maybe that comes from, the idea that surviving, in the country or in the west of America is not at all what it was when they were first settling it. It's generally much more stable these days, aside from the current tragic pandemic right now. The idea that with life a little bit on autopilot, we would decide to bring back one of the most challenging animals we've dealt with, a historic, you know, creature that just is at odds with like man establishing himself, and the storybook villain, I felt was really cool. And I just kind of that's what guided me through the rest of the process. And I think from that, I could push past some of the doom and gloom of the state of the globe even, and sort of like point of no return type of stuff, when the idea that like just writing an ecosystem that has been, you know put together over vast stretches of time into this perfect balance, when we just write that and all these amazing things can come from that, I felt like if we just listen to each other and start working together, we might be able to put right these gears of nature to do something well beyond what we're capable of. And I thought that was definitely not what I expected to feel. I expected to feel a little bit jaded about humanity, but instead I thought, this is kind of amazing. We're bringing things back. We're seeing the dead ends we've hit, and sometimes the road forward goes back the way we came.
Okay, cool. Well, this next question then may undo some of the stuff you just said, so I'm curious how you're going to ask it. The next question we have, um, have you spoken to any of the participants that you interviewed in the film after the fact and after they have seen the film? And in general, has any one group that was portrayed in the film spoken to you about their feelings about the film after the fact?
Yeah, people were certainly a little bit on edge during the making of the film. The ranchers, in particular, ranchers and outfitters that decided to participate in the film, they'd been portrayed in ways that they didn't feel were truthful, and a little bit, the bad guy type of portrayal in the things that they'd seen. So they almost weren't willing to participate. In fact, just really the night before, I secured that interview with Bill Hoppy, who's a pretty important piece of the story there, the rancher that killed one of the Yellowstone park wolves that came out onto his property. Just narrowly grabbed that interview, but it was only because I had talked to his friend, um, and his friend had put me in touch with him, and it wasn't just name dropping, but it was just like the sense that I was a part of the community and I wasn't just someone coming in from out of nowhere to tell the story I wanted to tell. I went through their community fabric to tell the story, and I found that although they were a little bit on edge, I got really, really good feedback from all of them. I was a little nervous, of course, but generally, if I talk about Bill Hoppy again, his grandchildren show up at the end of the film. Not intentional. He just ended up talking to us much longer than he was supposed to. He wasn't finished baling his hay. His daughter showed up to ask what's going on. And of course, oddly enough, this is just documentary for you. The granddaughter shows up with a stuffed wolf that she brings onto his trailer, and she happens to be asking him if he likes it. You can't. If you wrote this stuff, you would feel like it was too much, but it just sort of happened in front of us. And so we captured that moment. We knew it had to be in the film, but I had to get releases from the daughter. And so I needed to maintain some kind of connection there and make sure that she liked the film and the way they were shown before she would sign a release. And through that process, I kept a little bit of a connection. And when I finished the film and showed it to her, she said, you did a really great job telling his story, and we really appreciate it. Which was perfect to hear, and made all the hard work to get that story done right worthwhile. Some of the younger ranchers that were more coexistence minded in their approach, I thought were really just fantastic. It's still great to hear from them. They weren't a shoe-in either by any means. They really didn't want to be sold as the solution. They wanted to be people as they were, just experimenting on the landscape. I think there's a good lesson there for Colorado, about how you bring ranchers on board. It's not about telling them their landscape better than they do, but it might be to show some different things that are working in other places. Anyway, they got back to me and said, we've seen a lot of these things, and this is the best one that we've seen. It does the best job showing all the different sides of it. So it was really fulfilling. And I love this question because it's just very cool I've also wanted to check in with the people in the film throughout it to make sure that none of the ideas, are losing ground, losing traction. And in fact, a lot of them have continued to go even further. The idea of getting to know the wolves on your property, and if they're not causing problems, keeping them there so that they will keep other wolf packs that might be problematic from coming in.
Okay.
So I've kept in touch.
Cool. Well, let's shift now to a question. A number of people asked the same question. A lot of us here have talked over the last years with folks and use Yellowstone as an example of, something that happened that's quite illustrative. In your own words, what lessons did you come away with from Yellowstone that you think might be relevant to someone weighing a question of whether they should vote to restore wolves in Colorado?
Well, so all I can do is sort of, speculate about what things and would translate well. And it's a different state. It's going to be slightly different. It's very different to not have a national park right there. That's one of the bigger ones in the country that people come from all over the world to visit. And having wolves that are inside that boundary and outside the boundary. But the things that I could see transposing over were a few different ideas here. I think, just understanding up front that the coexistence piece isn't purely the predator-human interaction and exchange. It's very much the human to human, the differing politics and different ideologies, and what the wolf ends up becoming as a symbol. There are identities baked in these things, and just being really aware of that as you come in to create your plan, that it's not even, you'd love it to be the biological facts and all those pieces that are the proof for or against bringing them in, but it's so much more that happens around it. I would say that, and to that point, the next thing I would say was really trying to depoliticize wolves as much as possible. And the one that I see come up that might be hopefully an easy fix when I post, a video that gets out to a broader population of people. You hear a lot about, the giant Canadian wolves myth of, they reintroduced a much bigger wolf to Yellowstone, and people don't even know. And why would they do that? And they're Canadian wolves. Like, if you really want to draw a hard boundary there. Well, the thing that I heard about that gives me some comfort was that if you looked at the actual distances that wolves can travel and do travel, you would find that actually the wolves that originally were in the Montana and Idaho areas that we're talking about would have traveled those distances and would have been breeding and interbreeding with some of those wolves that came from the very same area they took them from. But I think the solve here is to, bring the public into those decisions, create that narrative, and tell the story of exactly why those wolves are coming from there. Of course, we shouldn't probably Jurassic Park them, to be the exact breed that or subspecies that lived in Colorado originally. That would be hard and strange, but there is some need for understanding there, because what happens is it just becomes kind of an easy cop out to not change or not try to get with the program that is happening in the state. So we just want everyone to be involved in that and understand it. I've got a few here, so this one's going to take a little bit longer, but to that effect, you know, I could see bringing in ranchers that from the Yellowstone area who've been through what I'll say like the 5 stages of grief on their property, of learning to accept wolves that they never wanted, which is quite a process. To learn from those people who aren't just going to be optimists really about living with wolves, but more realists instead, so they can tell their story and share the learnings that they've had and the things they've come to terms with maybe eventually accepting, I have wolves on my property, they're not causing me a problem, like I said before, they're keeping out the more problematic wolves that could move in. It's actually better to keep them. Things like that just come from real experience. At least some of that built into the training programs, I think would be a really nice way to do that and work on the change there and the training programs. Moving from there, the depredation reimbursements, as you see in the film, that some of it can be very hard to prove, that a wolf killed your livestock, and that's hard to understand. Sometimes if you're not in the industry, or if you've seen certain types of ranches functioning one way, other ranches function another way. Some are on horseback, some are not. But I think creating a wolf loss program, reimbursement program that's empowering is kind of a must, something that fits the ranchers' lifestyles. And one way that's interesting is that I'll mention is there's it's learning from those ranchers from the area. But speaking of the ranchers from the area, Malou from my film, who worked with the White Park cattles there, in there that are that breed that's a little more ancient and used to defending their territory to wolves and predators and chasing them off. She's been working on a project that's called Teal Tags that is well underway and hopefully done fairly soon, but it's essentially a herd monitoring device that will come to your phone and give you updates, give you the ability, if it senses a disturbance with the cows, to have a quick webcam view of what's going on there. It will allow them to archive and maybe get footage of any depredations that happen, just taking the guessing and the challenge out of reimbursement, making ranchers feel a lot more comfortable and just much more able to see what's actually happening on their property. I think that's a really exciting future. And we did some presentations with this one with some of the film festivals. And what I think is exciting about it is they don't start with technology to impose that for the solve. Well, let's just create an app and we're done. They really have looked so much historically backward at, how cows used to be and how bison work and how they're able to defend themselves from wolves, and through all these husbanding practices that just generate different results by using natural solutions. Once they've done that, then they're putting technology onto it to just help out. Make technology has some very useful features, just using it sparingly so they can be helpful. I think that's really cool, and I'm excited about that. The last piece here is just keeping it out of the courts. What I see about the plan here is that, once wolves are reintroduced, they're on the ESA for now. They're federally managed, it sounded like, and someone could jump in and correct me if I was wrong here. I've been reading up on it. The moment that the plan is supposed to turn over to the state for management in the Yellowstone area went very wrong, because it got locked up in the courts. A couple of agencies battling over, were those numbers actually right for the states to be managing on, states not providing exactly the right plan. And instead of managing them and sticking to the deal, you have just wolf populations expanding at will. And what that did was create a lot of disenfranchised, ranchers, people that felt lied to. And then even the people that had put together a very nice plan really ended up looking like they hadn't done their job correctly. So I think, I'm not a lawyer for exactly how you would include something like this, but I think being able to stick to the original plan if something gets caught up in a stalemate until something new gets overturned, and is official, I think that would be a nice way to make sure that what happened there, 10 years of not managing wolves, doesn't happen, because it did a lot of damage.
Okay. Well, we've got a handful of more questions for you here. This next one might be a bit of a left turn. A lot of the people here on this webinar, the attendees, have been big supporters and would very much like Proposition 107 to pass, and kind of have been the front line responding to questions that the public asks when asked to, let's say, sign a petition or just have a conversation about this subject. You've looked at this a lot of different ways, and it was very up close and personal with a lot of folks who weren't all that excited about the prospect. So we had a question come in that says, what do you think is the most compelling argument against wolf reintroduction?
Yeah, I think I worry, no question, it's like the polarity and the division that will cause within the state. It can be the people problem that happens around them. The actual damage that wolves have done in the Yellowstone area is pretty minimal in terms of the entire, spectrum of the state and things like that. I think that some of the people in the film say 1% of livestock were depredated upon. So it is not as much the animal as it is the disagreement around them. And so there's a real opportunity here for you guys to put together a plan that's very inclusive and seems to bring everybody into it, to avoid a situation where it feels like the more populous areas have decided to put wolves on areas where they don't actually live. And beyond that, when you have federal government managing these things, just making sure that feels connected and doesn't feel like, the office over in Washington, D.C. that has no idea what's going on in the country of Colorado. So, the compelling argument is basically to just be a little bit jaded and say that there's no way we're going to be able to find a solve here. There's going to be people that hate them and people that love them, and it's going to tear the state in half. But I think being able to, again, look at what happened and learn some lessons and say, we definitely don't want to do that. We want to do that a bit differently. I think that allows you to keep moving forward if you want to.
Okay. All right, 2 more questions, and then we'll do the closing question. And these are more now specifically to what it was like making your film. What was the hardest part about making it?
Yeah, so the hardest part, it wasn't getting the right story was a challenge, but I was very passionate about that. I did end up wearing a lot of the hats on this one: planning, directing, producing, shooting, editing, even composing music for it. But that was a lot of work and it took a long time, but I still don't know that it was the hardest thing. The creativity came naturally and was a lot of fun. The thing, unfortunately, that really was hard was fundraising. It really held up the release and it held up the timing, and it came down to things like a couple of pieces of music that we didn't make were getting in the way of us being able to put it out there just because the cost was prohibitive. There was wildlife videography, plenty of wolves in there that had some cost. I think overall that didn't add up to more than we could handle to release the film, but it was certainly something. So for me, it was I started as a short film, and so deciding there's a great story here. We need to make it an hour-long piece. It needed a little bit different support, and so I think in the future, approaching a project with a different buy-in up front, a different partnership, and finding out a little bit more about the idea first. It's just sort of, for me, it's a learning. It was a big, first-time film, and you hate to complain about accidentally discovering something way more important that changes your entire life. So it's not that, but yeah, it was certainly the financial piece of it. It's a lifeblood for films, and sometimes you just want to do the creative part.
Okay. And then what was your favorite part about working with the wolves?
My favorite part about working with the wolves specifically. So we went to Yellowstone in August, was the time period that we had lined up our interviews to go shoot. And it turns out that that's a pretty hot time of year in the park. And we were set to go out with a wolf tracking expert, Nathan, who's in the film. And we just had one morning scheduled to find a wild wolf, get the footage, get his interview, move on to the next thing. We shot this in 6 days, so that's the thing. It was very fast. There was almost no wiggle room. But the fact that we were able to go out there, and sure enough, we saw one, and it was a mile away. And even with the biggest camera lens I could bring, it was kind of a speck on the screen in this little vignette. After that, nobody could say we were the wolf documentary team that never even seen a wild wolf. That was a cool piece of it. I've got a couple here. Just this one was more about people, but about a wolf. Hearing Doug Smith talk about 832 or the '06 female like it was a good friend of his that he had known for a lot of his life was just extraordinary, and it led us to really asking more questions about that story and shifting gears to capture more of that story on the ground. And then the other one that happened was we filmed wolf close-ups that are at the beginning of the film, the title sequence, and then toward the end at a wolf sanctuary in Washington called Wolf Haven International. And we got time to be in their sanctuary and rotate around to the different pens to capture the wolves. We didn't go in with them. We were filming through the fence and rigged the cameras accordingly so that we wouldn't get a whole bunch of fence in the shot. But there was a really interesting experience connecting with these wolves that have been rescued. They weren't exactly wild wolves, right? But they were in the sanctuary and they were very much wolves. So they still had an anxiety to them. You kind of had to build a little trust, and I got to watch that. There was one wolf in particular called Shadow that's a black wolf that's in the film, and he kind of created this pattern of activity with me. He would start at the very back and kind of work his way around, hiding a little bit, come out ever so slightly, and then turn around and go back. And he started kind of breathing differently as he went back, almost kind of this wheezing almost kind of sound that was a little caught me off guard at first. A couple more times he would come out a little bit closer each time, and I heard it really sounded like he was huffing and puffing all the way back. Eventually over time he ended up getting pretty close to the camera and more comfortable with me. I think he actually saw the camera as a very strange big contraption that he wasn't used to rather than just a person. But it left me with this feeling after I built the trust with him that maybe I understood the three little pigs and the big bad wolf huffing and puffing and blowing the house down. Because if people's only experience with wolves was this anxious huffing and puffing as they ran away to stay away from the people, then maybe we would write a story about that.
Okay. Here's the last question we have. And I know this one came from probably about 3 or 4 of the attendees. So if this rings a bell with anybody who's listening, this is your question. But I think it's maybe on the minds of more people too. And that is, people are asking, how can we share this film with other groups? Is there any way that we can screen it for other groups in places that it might have an impact?
Yeah, so like I said, the film is streamable. When it comes to hosting a big event, I do recommend that also, because the discussion afterward is generally really productive and really makes it even more. It's just an extension of the experience in the film. We have a link on the website to host a screening if you'd like to host a screening, and we just sort of navigate what that looks like to pull together. Very much the same process kind of Brian and I went through when putting together The Trouble with Wolves being used for Sierra Club in Colorado. So you could always reach out there. Organizations can show it, groups can show it. You can stream it if you find it on any of these different streaming platforms. And then, any advice for showing it in areas that maybe are more in need or getting out in front of people. I think you have to just be a little bit creative. I've certainly run into challenges with trying to get all sides of, all different people of the opposing views to watch this film. Some think it's going to be something different than it really is. And so, I think working with many different organizations and putting on screenings once that's actually possible. Again, it's a challenging time to do that right now. Just finding ways to make it useful for different groups, sort of on their terms, I would say. Are there other organizations? If you're talking about a different community that may not go out of their way to watch a film about wolves, how do you find a way to get those people to see it, just so you have as much of the state informed as possible when it comes to the vote? It takes balance and sort of trying to trying to let people know what the actual film is. I've definitely struggled with that a bit myself, but I would, yeah, that's all I can impart. You can definitely try and host a screening and just pull together as many, word of mouth connections and organizations that you can to do that.
Cool. Well, Colin, we're out of the questions that had came in advance. Did you have anything else that you wanted to relate to everybody's? We have 90 folks that are still listening to you right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that was too brief there. So I think I saw a different question come up that's kind of similar to what we were just talking about. Um, we saw some of these questions in advance. What can be done when you talk to people that might be clinging on to different ideas that you might disagree with, and you kind of are looking to find ways to get a little more open-mindedness. Particularly people who just maybe don't even want to consider wolves at all coming back to the landscape. Well, I thought this was an interesting one because it's very difficult. There are so many divisive things in the country right now, and wolves can be one of them. You can add one more onto the list if you're not careful. But for me, thinking about it, again, it's always challenging, but I think so often we approach a conversation with someone to try and be successful, to try and have our argument, win, have them be wrong. And therefore, of course, you can drop the mic and then they'll be on the wolf side. But it doesn't really work like that, and it's so different than trying to be useful to someone like that. I think if you think about the process of doing that, you're going to want to spend a lot more time, take an interest in their view, someone who disagrees with you, get to the root of why they might feel that way, and just really, again, it's listening. When they get down there sometimes, and if it's not a factually based belief, you just may find out, oh, I don't know, it's just something that I heard. But that sort of tills the field for new growth there, for thoughts, realizing there isn't an actual fact there to rely on. So, be prepared to spend time talking, not one and done, and just go with them. I wouldn't suggest approaching the conversation if you don't have time for that. It's not one soundbite and you're done, that kind of thing. These are long conversations. Nothing worthwhile comes easy. And so I really like the idea of looking at it being useful as opposed to just trying to be successful. This is an idea that actually came from a podcast on the Tim Ferriss show, and I think he's quite a supporter of Prop 107. So thank him for his great work too.
Well, we might want to. We've definitely had some interactions with Tim Ferriss in the podcast. I don't know if he would officially be supporting 107 specifically, but he definitely was a. I just thought I probably should mention that, but he
Sure.
definitely was. He became a very passionate believer in just the whole idea of wolf restoration and the bigger picture of what it would mean to restore an ecosystem. I mean, that's such a big idea. That's the kind of thing that he was totally jazzed about.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Never want to get things wrong.
Yeah. I just don't want to leave people the impression that he might be actual supporter. I'd like to leave you, Colin, with maybe 3 things that came up on chat as a way of maybe ending this segment. And if you want to react,
Very cool.
Go ahead.
Great.
One of our attendees wanted you to know that you made a brilliant documentary, and it was a very powerful and balanced perspective. Another said, the trouble with wolves is excellent. It's filmed and presented in a way that kept me relaxed and not wanting to strangle the anti-wolf folks. And I am very pro-wolf and prone to wanting to strangle anti-wolf folks. And then finally, someone who wrote in and said, thank you, Colin, for your voice and for your work.
Thank you all. That's so great to hear.
And with